Let's speak to Dan Perry, who's the author of the Ask Questions Later newsletter. He's also the former Associated Press regional editor for Europe, the Middle East and Africa. Joining us from Tel Aviv. Thanks for your time. This is a pretty damning report when it comes to Israel. How do you think authorities will view it?
As part of a very complicated equation. Look, I, of course, agree. It's very damning. I believe it is the largest number of journalists killed in any country that CPJ has recorded in the course of 1 year. That said, this is a particularly cataclysmic situation in Gaza, and essentially the heart breaks at the loss in this conflict, all the loss of life in this conflict, and that includes the journalists. And while the life of a journalist is not worth more than that of anyone else, of course, they need to be protected, and they are protected under international law, and they play such a vital role in getting information out, doubly so, I'd say, in the case of Gaza, where outsider
access
I mean,
they are you're right, they are protected under international law, but these rights are being violated by Israel almost on a daily basis.
Look, I am hoping to hear from the Israelis a detailed response to this, and perhaps even an expression of remorse, or at least regret, that so many journalists have ended up among the dead. And I think to properly deal with this issue would require a detailed accounting of each case, even though they're very busy. I think it would be, if nothing else,
but is part of the problem here, Dan Perry,
that reputational point of view.
Is part of the problem here the impunity that Israel seems to enjoy? Because CPJ also put out a report in May 2023. It's called Deadly Pattern, and it says that the Israeli military has a long record of killing journalists with impunity, with at least 20 journalists killed over 22 years.
Yeah, look, I wouldn't call it impunity, but it is extremely problematic. They've not been as transparent as one would like in the cases of these journalists. And frankly, just from a PR point of view, when a journalist is killed, it's kind of a reputational disaster. And I don't notice that they seem to get that always. That said, without diminishing the report, I wouldn't counsel total indifference to what I know would be the Israeli defense, even though some may see that as excuses. And there are a number of factors that I know Israel would cite, and it isn't all propaganda. And one thing I think needs to be pointed out is that when journalists are killed in a war, it's generally one of three things. They either took risks and were unlucky, or the military that killed them was careless or indifferent to their journalist status, or they were deliberately targeted for being journalists. Now, when the CPJ puts out these reports, the implication by many who read them is the latter, that this is courageous reporters being assassinated by despotic regimes for their courage and for their work. I don't think this is generally the case here. The CPJ report itself mentions some cases where there is suspicion of targeting, but there are few, certainly a small minority. Moreover, in the case of your own Hamza al-Dakhdouh, Israel doesn't deny targeting, but it says that this was because he was accused of terrorist activity, rightly or wrongly.
Right. I mean, Israel does make these accusations, but it doesn't provide sort of credible evidence. The CPJ is also saying in its report that it's raised concerns about the targeting of members of the media. It's investigating about a dozen cases of journalists who were deliberately targeted by Israeli soldiers. Why do you think that Israel deliberately targets journalists?
I don't have actual evidence that they deliberately target journalists. I would think that we're talking here about some combination of just the density of the population and so many people being killed. Remember, the 78 journalists who've been killed are half of 1% of the population. That may be an underrepresentation of journalists. I do not know. It depends on who qualifies as a journalist. But I do agree that there are cases of apparent indifference and a light trigger finger. You saw that also in the event where the IDF killed 3 of their own hostages. And by the way, it doesn't help that Israel can claim with some truth that Hamas and their fellow travelers have been known to identify themselves as journalists falsely, to commandeer ambulances and the rest of it. It is a god-awful mess.
The Israeli military says, and they said this back in November, that they, quote, cannot guarantee the safety of reporters in the Gaza Strip. I mean, this is an admission that is basically in complete contradiction of the principles on protecting journalists as defined by international law, is it not?
Look, yes and no. It's not a great statement. It's not a great look. But of course, any military will tell you they can't guarantee the safety of journalists if they place themselves in a war zone. Now, obviously, the entire place is a war zone. So you would hope that they would take more concrete steps. And I mean, I guess that would be my call on Israel. to project what it is they're doing to prevent the deaths of journalists while they're covering their job, the story that is their job. Now, look, I have been involved in a previous iteration as a chairman of the Foreign Press Association in Israel in dealing with both the Israeli authorities and the Palestinian ones on issues of access and security. Now, we demanded access and we also demanded security, but even as I was demanding those things, I was not unaware that they're somewhat in contradiction, because if we get the IDF to remove the closed military zone, for example, and allow the journalists in, then that creates the kind of risk factor for the journalists that makes their security more difficult to guarantee. I understand this. I think journalists who are in a war zone, who go in there as foreign correspondents, understand it very well. It's a little bit different in a situation like Gaza, where you're talking about local people who have no choice but to be there, and their job is only going to make their situation even more precarious. And so, yes, I mean, I'd like to see more done to guarantee their safety, but there are no guarantees in a war zone, and I think if we're going to be serious about this, we have to understand that, and the CPJ itself understands it. I know them very well.
Thank you so much, Dan Perry, for joining us from Tel Aviv.
My pleasure.